Today is the 29th day of November, 2014, and we are very pleased to have Richard Hartz with us. Richard, welcome. Namaskar.
Namaste.
When did you first hear of Sri Aurobindo or Mother?
I discovered Sri Aurobindo entirely on my own through the Life Divine. To explain how that happened, I'll have to go back. Shall I tell the story?
Oh, yes, yes.
It's not much of a story. It's more a process of development from my childhood, which led me to read The Life Divine and Savitri at the age of 18 without ever having met anyone who had ever heard of Sri Aurobindo or the Mother.
So no one in the family
No one
had any interest
in any way
or knowledge?
connected. No one I knew, no one in the family had any knowledge of Sri Aurobindo. Now, this came about purely through my own search, through a philosophical quest which began at about the age of 15. Up until then, I had been brought up with a scientific worldview, basically. I had a very strong aversion for religion. I had had a bad experience with the Protestant Presbyterian Church and had no interest whatsoever in religion. I was influenced by my father's scientific outlook. And from my childhood, one of my most vivid memories was of a book called A Natural History of the World, which had pictures.
I remember it.
Really?
Yes.
Pictures of the formation of the earth, the age of the dinosaurs, and so on. And these images were engraved in my mind, and this was kind of the mythology that I grew up with, was evolution. I didn't believe in religion, and so in place of that, what I had was science. There was another book which was quite, made a strong impression on me. It was a book of pictures from the microscopic to the galactic levels, which step by step, starting from a scene on the ordinary human level, went in two directions, one towards the smaller and smaller and one towards the larger and larger by multiples of about 10, I think. So it went towards down step by step to the cellular level and then went the other direction to an image of the whole galaxy that we live in. And this, somehow it expanded my consciousness, and I became preoccupied with the idea of infinity, particularly of the very vast. And I used to ask myself what infinity means. I was convinced that there can't be an end to the universe, because if there was, there would be something beyond that. And so I never arrived at a solution to this, of course, but that was the way I was thinking, and the sort of question that I was preoccupied with at an early age. I was very good at mathematics. That was what I was best at when I was young. But I had a peculiar approach to math, which was that I used to like to jump straight from the problem to the solution, rather than it was frustrating for my teachers because I didn't like to write down the steps by which I arrived at an answer. But I used to sort of contemplate the problem, and then, without going necessarily through all the steps that I had been taught, I would get the answer. the result was I became a very good mathematical problem solver, and in high school there was an annual mathematics competition in which in my senior year of high school I was third in my state, the state of Washington where I grew up, which means I was fairly clever at mathematics, although by that time I was losing interest in it. What had happened was when I was in junior high school, I started to teach myself calculus, which was far ahead of what the other students were learning. And that was kind of typical, that kind of set a pattern, because from then on I was always exploring fields of knowledge for myself. And the first was mathematics, so I taught myself differential and integral calculus up to a certain level when that wasn't introduced at all in school. I did this just on my own. And so it looked like I was probably headed for a career in mathematics or theoretical physics or something. In spite of my early interest in evolution, I was not inclined towards the biological sciences, but I was inclined towards pure mathematics, and I certainly had an aptitude for it.
Any philosophical interest at that time?
Okay, that began with a very specific incident, which was that one day in the 9th grade in an English class, my teacher happened to mention that there had been a man named Descartes who had written a book called Meditations on the First Philosophy. And the way he had arrived at what he wrote in this book was to sit and doubt everything that he thought that he knew, to kind of make a clean slate, and then ask himself what he could be certain of. And the conclusion of course, everyone knows, was cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. One can criticize that conclusion, but first of all, the method was, I was quite
it was a great
struck.
interest to you.
I was very struck by this method. I had never heard of meditation. I had never even heard of philosophy until that day. Growing up in America, it's a very philosophically unsophisticated culture, and I didn't come from a cultured background. My father was brilliant in his own field, but he was a civil engineer. His field was structural mechanics. I had really never even heard of philosophy, much less meditation. But just this, and I never pursued an interest in Descartes. I never actually read further in Descartes' writings, but just the idea of, first of all, doubting everything that we take for granted, the appearances of the world as we experience it through our senses, and then asking, what do we know? And what I got from that was the only thing really certain was consciousness. Descartes said thought, but for me, I didn't at that point distinguish thought from consciousness, but what I really understood from that was that the one thing real is consciousness. That meant that I began very soon after that to question the conclusions of science, which I had been brought up to believe was could give the answers to all our problems. But I started to realize that science was never going to solve this question of consciousness, that science explained consciousness through the brain, but the brain is a material object, and matter, I couldn't see how you were ever going to get from matter to consciousness through the methods of science. And therefore I started to lose interest in science, and I did become interested in philosophy. And the two philosophers, of course I only had access to Western philosophy, the two philosophers who most interested me from the ages of maybe this was 15, 16 up to about 17, 18 were Plato and Spinoza. Plato with his, idealism, his theory of ideas, but particularly what I remember most being impressed by in Plato was the allegory of the cave in the Republic, which is a way of conveying the idea that our experience of the world is not an experience of reality as it is. The allegory of the cave describes prisoners who have spent their whole lives looking at images projected on the wall of their cave, two-dimensional images, and they've never seen the world outside of the cave. They've never seen the sun. They've never seen three-dimensional reality. And so Plato describes one of these prisoners being freed and being led out up into the upper world of the sun, and then seeing the real world, and then coming back and trying to explain that to his fellow prisoners and being unable to do so. This, I really, I was fascinated by this idea, although I didn't quite know what to make of it, and Plato itself didn't really lead me to any conclusion. But the idea that there could be a different experience of reality is what I got from Plato. From Spinoza, I got the idea that God is everywhere, which is not the way God had been presented to me up until then. I could have conceivably, discovered much of what I found through philosophy, through religion, but I didn't, because that wasn't really an available option. And I didn't...
Especially in the light of your bad experience.
yeah. I had actually been taken to, I remember very clearly my first experience of religion. I don't know what age it was. I was young, but it was too late to start indoctrinating me in the religion I was supposed to have grown up with. I think it was a sort of an afterthought that my parents thought that to be a proper member of American society, I should have some exposure to religion. But when they took me to church one fine day, Sunday, what I very clearly remember is we must have arrived late because, and I was, supposed to go to Sunday school, but as we approached, I heard a lot of kids singing, and they were singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." And I remember thinking, what kind of nonsense is this? And I actually felt sick to my stomach, and I can remember, who is this Jesus? What is this book called the Bible, and why should I believe some far-fetched, that some person who died 2,000 years ago loves me on the basis of a book that I have no reason to have.
And you were quite young yet.
I was quite young, yes. This freed me from a lot of potential baggage of growing up in America. Another experience, not a particular experience, but speaking of the very insular American culture that I grew up in, at the age of 12, my whole family went to Europe for a year, where my father was a visiting professor in the Technical Institute in Zurich. So I went to school in German for a year, and we traveled around Europe. So I was exposed there to something a little wider than what most Americans grew up knowing. And this, again, was something in my childhood which I think helped a little bit to make me open to eventually spending my life, in another part of the world. But my pursuit of the, of an understanding of reality through philosophy led me, I think, to this kind of pantheism. But another turning point was when I first met some people from India. And this came about because my father was a professor of engineering. He had students from India. He had, in those days, that was engineering was what many Indians went to study.
And this was in your home state?
He was a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I grew up in Seattle. I had been born in Berkeley, California, but we had come to Seattle when I was 5 or 6. So I grew up there and was exposed to the beauty of nature in Washington. This was another factor. The mountains were so awe-inspiring, and I got a kind of intimation of something through nature also, a little bit like what Wordsworth describes in his poetry. I had something of that kind of experience when I was young. These are all various influences which somehow led me to be ready for what happened when I was 18, which was first talking to some of these Indian engineering students who were not particularly spiritual, but practically every Indian has a philosophical and spiritual side of some kind. And so just through talking to these very ordinary Indians, I came to feel that there was something that they had which I was not finding in my own culture. So I turned from studying Western philosophy to studying Indian philosophy. And after a few months of that, my father, who always encouraged my intellectual interests, whatever they were, even though they had no relation to his own, picked up a book at the University of Washington bookstore, which this book was called A Source Book in Indian Philosophy. I think a Source Book of Indian Philosophy. And this was it, because this book started with the Vedas, went through the Upanishads, the Gita, and so on, but at the end it had Aurobindo. And it was a very generous excerpt from The Life Divine, about 40 pages. And as soon as I read that, I knew that, at least this phase of my search was finished, that I didn't have to pursue any more philosophies, that I had found the one that I was looking for. So then I started to, look to see if I could find anything more about Aurobindo. I went to some bookstores. The only book that I found was a book that had been brought out by the California Institute of Asian Studies, which contained articles about Aurobindo. It was a book that I forget what it was. That book. That book. Yes. And that had an article by Jyoti Priya on Savitri.
Oh, I see.
So at this point, I knew about 2 books. I knew The Life Divine and Savitri. This was in August 1969. And I might mention that this was the 1960s, and I was 18 years old, but I was completely untouched by the so-called counterculture of the 60s, the whole, what people think of when they think of America in the 60s and people of my generation. It completely bypassed me. I was not in touch with that at all. And I wasn't the least bit interested in the music that most people of my age were listening to. I was, in fact, just at this time discovering the late Beethoven string quartets and piano sonatas, and this sort of thing, entirely on my own, a little bit in the way that I had done mathematics, not being from a very cultured background because my parents had grown up in rural North Dakota. There was no classical music in my household, but I had been taken to piano lessons and became quite good at the piano, and I picked up the French horn and played in youth orchestras. So music was another side of my upbringing, which has ended up being quite important in my life in the ashram, but it was a sort of a side.
At that time.
But still, through music also I was opening to something which I couldn't put a name on. It was only when I started to read Aurobindo that I started to understand what all these things were, and everything came together. But in any case, I had, on my own, between the ages of 15, gone from Descartes to Aurobindo, and was reading The Life Divine and Savitri, and this happened the month before I started college. I had been accepted at Yale University for a special program in philosophy. I had also been accepted at Cornell for mathematics, but by that time I had decided against mathematics and was going to pursue philosophy. Unfortunately for my studies at Yale, what was offered was Western philosophy, and I had just lost interest.
How did you find a copy of Savitri?
Savitri I found at the Yale Library. I didn't until I arrived at Yale. I didn't actually have a copy of either The Life Divine or Savitri. But this happened pretty fast because it was August 1969 that I, was introduced to Aurobindo through this book and the other book that I found. And then the next month I found myself at Yale, which has a huge library, which had all of Aurobindo's works. The ones that I immediately looked for were The Life Divine and Savitri, which I had checked out and started reading. Later on, then I looked through the card catalog and found that there were other books by Aurobindo. So during my year at Yale, instead of what I was supposed to be doing, I ended up reading also The Synthesis of Yoga, essays on the Gita, The Secret of the Veda. Those are the ones I particularly remember. And at the end of the year, I decided not to continue at Yale because in the meantime, I had discovered that not only were there books, but there was a place. That Aurobindo had founded an ashram, which I didn't know at
Before
first
that,
at
yes,
all.
yes.
As I said, I'd never met anybody who had heard of Aurobindo. But I discovered that there was an ashram. And the moment I knew that there was a place called Pondicherry in India, and that there was a community dedicated to the ideals of Aurobindo, I decided that was where I wanted to go. So that was that.
You hadn't met anyone in Yale who knew of
I met
Aurobindo?
someone from California who had heard of Aurobindo, I think from San Francisco, who had been to the East Cultural Integration Fellowship,
Right.
or whatever, the California Institute of Asian Studies, as it was
I think
then
it was
called.
CIF then. Yes.
Yeah. But didn't know anything much. Basically, this was still all on my own. So then I found myself, after my year at Yale, I was sitting at home continuing to read Aurobindo. My father then got the idea that if I was so interested in Indian philosophy, I should study Sanskrit, which hadn't actually occurred to me on my own, but as soon as he suggested the idea,
It clicked.
I had been reading essays on the Gita and The Secret of the Veda were two of the books that I liked the most of Aurobindo, and they were full of Sanskrit. So immediately I took up the opportunity of learning Sanskrit. He checked the books out from the University of Washington Library to get me started, and so I started learning Sanskrit. It turns out that it wasn't so easy to get to India. First of all, I had made one major miscalculation. This was 1970 now. This was the days of the Vietnam War and the draft in the United States, and I had not thought about what I was going to do when I lost my student deferment from the draft. So I then had to think about that, and also I didn't have any money to come to India anyway. So what happened was that faced with the draft, the draft, and they had at that time what this horrible system called the draft lottery.
Yes, I remember it.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Every year, all the young men of a certain age had their birth dates put into this lottery, and they were assigned a number according to birth date. And my birth date happened, although it was a very auspicious date in some ways, was very inauspicious from the point of view of the draft lottery. And so I had to do something about this. A friend advised me that if I enlisted for an extra year in the Army, for an occupation of my choice, that I could have the guarantee of not having to go to Vietnam. So I was more likely to survive my time in the Army if I did that. So I enlisted for the Army Band, which was just 50 miles from home. And I played the French horn, so I could join the band. So I ended up for 3 years sitting around this army base with actually relatively little to do. And during that time, I taught myself Sanskrit. Meanwhile, I had ordered the books from India. And so I continued my reading of Aurobindo, but I taught myself Sanskrit for 3 years. And when I got out, I was, in the meantime, halfway through that, I had visited India finally. A friend, strangely enough, he was a sergeant in the band, advised me that if I wanted to come to India, it was a fairly intelligent person. He was in the band because his family had a military tradition, and he had joined the army. But you're a relatively cultured person, and when he came to know of my desire to go to India, he suggested that I not take my Christmas leave for 2 weeks, that I save it up, and that later I was eligible for another 2 weeks. I could come for a month at a time. I could get 1 month of leave at a time. And so coming up was the Aurobindo's birth centenary in August 1972. And so I took a month of leave from the Army in August 1972 and came to India. So I was here for the darshan. I saw the mother only in the balcony,
Yes.
the terrace darshan.
Yes.
But I did see her. I was here there was a huge crowd, of course, but I came. And
Where did you stay?
I stayed at 3 different guest houses because there was such a huge crowd.
Yes.
I started at the seaside and ended up staying in. For a while, I had to stay in some local guest house. But
At that time, did you meet any of the elder Ashramites?
no, I didn't meet any elder ashramites. I didn't really meet anybody. I met visitors at that time. I didn't really meet anybody. it was on my second visit in 1974 that I, m- no, even then I didn't really meet any elder ashramites. Before I actually was able to settle in India, which happened only in 79, I came for 3 visits. And in 1978, I met Amal Kiran. He was the elder ashramite that I had the closest
Oh.
contact with. And also his wife, Lalita.
Mhm.
I used to go and play on her piano. This was in the summer of 78. I spent the whole summer here. I also took Jagannathji's Sanskrit classes. Otherwise, I didn't really meet any elder ashramites at that time. Amal had quite a fairly strong influence on me. I had developed an interest in poetry by this time.
And he was editing Mother India.
He was editing Mother India.
Yes, yes.
By this time, I was interested in translating Sanskrit poetry, and he encouraged me to translate Kalidasa, and I translated The Cloud Messenger using the meter which Aurobindo had used for his lost translation, which he described, and just some fragments of it were preserved. So, and he published it in Mother India. I met Vijay Poddar, I think. I didn't really meet any elder ashramites apart from
On the first 3 visits.
in any of my first 3 visits.
Yeah.
No, I had met not the older Amal's generation. And my second visit, I had met Paru Patel, the registrar of the school. She very much well, somehow it just didn't. She wanted me to meet Kirit Joshi, but he had gone to Delhi, and he was expected back, but he didn't. He never came back.
This
He ended
was
up.
when he was doing
this
the
was-
work for
yeah.
Aurobindo.
Yeah. Anyway, so he ended up not coming back while I was there. So I never met him. I met him much later, but in the meantime,
So how did you get to come here permanently?
finally, I had in '76, after I graduated, I had after finishing the army, I was then eligible for the GI Bill, which meant it would pay for my education. I could go back to college, and it was paid for by the United States government. So I went to the University of Washington, which happened to have a South Asian Studies department. They offered Sanskrit, Hindi, and Tamil, and so I joined Sanskrit at the 3rd year level, which was the most advanced undergraduate course that they had. I was given advanced placement credits because I had already done all the preliminary work, and I was in a class of 2 people. There were only 2 students in the class, but the South Asian department received some kind of special federal funding, so that there was no minimum class size. So I had a wonderful time at the University of Washington studying Indian culture, languages. I learned Hindi as well, which, and particularly I was interested in Old Hindi, the medieval bhakti literature, Surdas, Tulsidas, Kabir. I also read Vidyapati, although he wrote in Maithili. It was, sort of classified as Hindi. And I also started studying Tamil because I got interested at that time in maybe coming to Auroville.
Mm.
So in 1976, after graduating with a BA from the University of Washington, I made an attempt to come to India to come to Auroville, but I couldn't get a visa because the troubles were beginning at that time. And also I didn't know anybody still that could help me with the visa problem. So I wasn't able to come, so I went back for master's a master's degree at the University of Washington, continued my studies.
And your master's was in?
And this was in South Asian, it was Asian languages and literature, which meant I continued Sanskrit. I actually worked quite a bit then in Hindi because I had a more congenial relationship with the faculty in Hindi than Sanskrit at that point. But I also started learning Tamil. So by the time I actually came to India, I had a pretty good background in Indian languages. I had also, in the meantime, taught myself on the side a bit of Greek, ancient Greek, because I thought that was such an important part of Aurobindo's own background, and he refers so much to Greek literature, and he also had a theory of linguistics, which I was interested in, for which it would be important to learn Greek. So I studied, I learned Latin, which I hadn't done earlier. Taught myself, went through a one-year introductory course in Latin.
Did you ever meet Ned Carney?
That came a little bit later, but actually was ended up being very influential. That's a little bit further along.
Pick that up a little
But
later.
in the meantime, I had, in '79, I had come to India. Finally, I had a visa, not a residential permit exactly, but a student visa to study Tamil in Madurai for a year at the American Institute of Indian Studies Institute. They had a program in languages for graduate students. I had finished my master's degree and was eligible for this program, and Madurai being so close to Pondicherry, I chose that rather than the Hindi program in Delhi. So I came and I studied Old Tamil, I read Tirukural, Kambaramayanam, some of the great classics of Tamil literature with a very good Tamil pundit in Madurai. And meanwhile, I started visiting the ashram for a weekend whenever I could. And at that time, the archives was looking for someone who knew Sanskrit. And I remember on New Year's Day, 1980, Jagannathji approached me. He was working in collaboration with the archives on Aurobindo's Sanskrit writings. There was an Upanishad that Aurobindo had written in Sanskrit, which Jagannathji had translated, and I had been asked to revise the translation. So I had that contact. And
but you were still in Madurai.
I was in Madurai, I came.
But would come
I
weekends.
came, yeah. And so I was here for the first of for New Year's Day in 1980, which of course is one of the New Year is always one of the most beautiful days in the ashram. And so I was here, and I was asked if I would like to work at the archives. And
let's take a little break. We have so much more to cover, and we like to break our interviews at about 40, 45 minutes.